Hi everybody, this is Eben Illingworth here, the product marketer for Nintex Workflow. And today I'm going to take us through a session focusing on two popular areas where we see some of the most powerful Nintex Workflow features deployed, and that is employee hires, or the processes involved when new employees join a company. And another is document assembly, the features of workflow that allow us to assemble documents automatically drawn from content and data and intelligence all over our network and our business. I'm going to start out by creating a very simple workflow to give you an overview of what that new employee process might look like. It's really going to be a functional level workflow, something that really will be quite basic. I'm going to move on from there to show you a full-blown example of something that you're more likely to see in the real world that would take more than 5 or 10 minutes to build, but still following the same functional logic as that initial example. From there, I'm going to tack on a bit of document assembly features to that solution and then take you through a little bit of a deeper dive into how we might construct a full-blown document assembly solution. And I'm going to use a contract as an example of a document that we can build. I'll finish up by giving you a very brief look at some of the online resources available to you as you're constructing and exploring your own workflows and automation. And finally, we'll finish with a Q&A. And the Q&A this session will be a little bit different from the last in that it will start after the 30 minutes have elapsed during the presentation itself. So if you find yourself unable to stick around past that 30-minute mark, don't panic. Everything is being recorded, and everyone who's listening now will get an email with a link they can use to download the recorded session as well. So you won't miss anything. Speaking of communications, what you see on the screen here is a list of phone numbers, one of which at least will be in your region, that you can use to connect to the audio bridge, the phone bridge. So if at any point you decide not to use mic and speakers, which is the default that most of you are using right now, you can call into the number in your region. You can use the access code on the screen and listen with a toll-free call. Now, you'll have this information already in your invitation that you received, and you'll have it in Outlook if you accepted that invitation as a meeting request. But just in case you don't have it handy, there it is again. And as I said, if you want to phone in rather than use mic and speakers, then that's your avenue. If you'd like to ask a question along the way, please do. You'll see a little icon, a little button that looks like a raised hand just underneath the top left corner of the GoToMeeting console. You can enter in your question there, and at the end of the session, I'll have a log of all of the questions that have been asked. Now, we have a fairly high attendance, and I may not get to all of the questions that get asked. If you still have something that you'd like to discuss or ask, or some feedback that you'd like to pass on about the webinar and what you might like to see in the future, then at the end of the session, you'll be able to fill out a very brief form. You're not obliged to, but you can, and that's a great place to ask any questions that I might have missed or that you didn't ask during the session itself, and as I said, a great place for feedback. Without ado, I will get us started. Now, I'm looking at SharePoint 2010 here. Most of you probably would have noticed that by now. What I'm going to show you in this section works just as well for SharePoint 2007 and Workflow 2007. So the interface, the UI experience might be a little bit different, but the tools that I'm showing you are available in both. So I'm going to start with a new employee hires, a new onboarding process. So as people join my company, I'm going to add them into a list of new employees. Now, this is a very basic SharePoint list. There's no info path or custom development going on here. It's a whole lot of fields, as you can see, but really only a few are actually obligatory. The nice thing about using SharePoint as a means of storing this kind of centralized information is that Nintex Workflow finds it very, very easy to access information in these fields. And that's great news, because if you can access it with Nintex Workflow, you can push that information out to just about anywhere. So if you've got financial applications or other business apps on the network, we can use this as almost a hub and spoke kind of an information distribution network, if you will. But for now, we're just entering in a few fields. If I wanted to, I could map each of these fields to Active Directory, for example, or other databases, push that information through with my workflow. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to fill out some basic fields, give you an idea of what that experience is like, and then go in and start building a workflow that is going to run behind this list. And you'll notice that I'm not opening up a separate application. I don't have to deal with any separate consoles or anything like that. We're using what's already in SharePoint. We're using the SharePoint workflow engine, and we're just giving you a nice graphical designer on top of it. So this whole thing is really only about 60 megs to install. It takes about 20 minutes. It's really a piece of cake. Anyway, I'm going to start out with what's called a parallel action, because I know I want to run several sub-processes at once, several runs of actions at once, and they're not dependent on one another. So I'm going to start with 3 actions, and the first thing I'm going to do is create a user account in Active Directory. Every employee needs one to access the network, so of course our new employee will need one as well. And all of these fields could be filled out using those same fields that you saw on the form. Some of them I'm going to hard code though. So for instance, I'm choosing where in Active Directory I want that to go. I'm going to give some user credentials for the administrator account, because you don't necessarily have people initiating these processes, entering in these new employees who have access to back-end systems like Active Directory. So it's nice to be able to provide some custom credentials so that the person can still do what they need to do with the process, but doesn't have to be granted these high-level IT type accounts. I'm going to give this a username and a common name that I'll be known by on the network. I'm going to leave the rest of these blank, but if I wanted to, as I said, I could pull in information from the form itself. It's all just point and click here, pretty basic stuff. So if I wanted to do it this way, then anytime the full name was filled out on the form for any new employees, that would get used as a display name in Active Directory. So pretty easy to flow stuff through from one place to another. One handy thing I am going to use is the generation of a password, and I'm going to store that password in what we call a variable. So variables are great for storing information and then reusing it later in the workflow. And it's great for branching processes too, depending on what's in the variable. But I'm just going to use it to store this password so that if I send a notification later on, then I can let people know what the password is to log on. Managers would be good people to know that. Obviously the users themselves haven't logged in yet, so they won't be getting any email. I'm also going to give this person some permissions on the network. So I'm going to do that by adding them to an Active Directory group. And pretty similar stuff here from the previous action. Again, I'm choosing where that group is located. I'm putting in some credentials. I'm specifying who the user is and what group we're adding them to. Pretty straightforward stuff. And at that point, they'll have not only access to the network, but to the assets on the network that they're going to need to do their job. The last thing I'm going to do in this branch is give them an email inbox, an Exchange account. And that's really very similar to the other two actions. I'm not going to dig too deeply into that. I think we've seen enough fields to fill out at this stage. But that's the 3 core actions to get users up and running on the network. Now, In parallel to that, I might also want to involve another department, say the finance department. I might want to send them notification letting them know somebody new has joined and there's some work they need to do, like updating their banking details or sorting out the system that accrues their vacation. There's probably a fair amount of data entry and a fair amount of parallel processes that need to happen in other departments to accommodate this new employee. I might even want to automate that process by using a web service call to call another application on the network. Pretty much every application, business application these days, has web services you can interact with, and that's one of the integration options we have if you want to automate some of those parallel processes. So for example, rather than having somebody in finance type in all the information, we might be just pushing that through straight to the application, again based on the same information that we pulled from that form. A lot of ways that you can do that kind of thing. We might even want to have a running list of equipment that needs to be provisioned for new employees. We might do that by having a list somewhere in SharePoint and then creating new items in that list that represents requests for new equipment, maybe a workstation, a laptop, stationery, what have you. That essentially is the goal or the logic behind these new employee processes. Now, what I like to do now is show you what a fully functional, fairly detailed new employee process looks like. Now, this is one that took more than a couple of minutes to build, but is still not a huge ask by any means. And you'll see what I mean in a second when I bring it up. We're doing essentially the same job here, but we're adding in a little bit more intelligence. So you'll notice that it's a bit wider than the last one because we're doing more things. We've got several branches here, and in general, we're moving from left to right. It's a little bit different from the parallel action that I showed you earlier. We're using what's called a state machine instead. And if you attended my earlier webinar in the Design Tips series, you'll have learned that webinars allow you to move backwards and forwards in a non-sequential fashion. So we're not executing each of these branches all at once. We're moving in a very specific order. It happens to be from left to right, but it could be in any order we want. And the reason we're doing it this way, or one of the main reasons, is that at the end of each branch, we have a little bit of error checking going on. So certain actions in Nintex workflow give you the capability of detecting whether an error has happened and trapping the text of that error. And what that does is it allows us to build in a bit of logic to handle those situations. So we're checking for an error, and if it's true, we're moving to another branch or state called handle error. And that branch is actually at the far right over here. And if we zoom in on it a little bit, we can see that if an error has occurred, we're sending a notification to the necessary people. We're removing the account and whatever assets were associated with it, and then we're exiting the workflow. Aside from that, it moves from left to right and from top to bottom. So the first thing we're doing again is creating an Active Directory account. We're being a little bit more clever this time. We're building the username using a build string action. So this is going to be a combination of the name fields that we collected from the form and some additional numbers, just a bit of a random factor that will also meet our username standards for the network. We're resolving that username, so we're querying Active Directory to make sure that that name doesn't exist already. And if it doesn't, then we're building an email address out of it. We're adding the domain that makes up the user's email address to their username so that we're ready to populate that information when we start creating the Active Directory account and creating the Exchange mailbox. There's the error checking that we talked about that moves us to that error state if anything bad has happened. And then an update item action that just updates the item in the list showing that the Active Directory account is being created and we're now moving to the next branch. From there, it's pretty straightforward. Fundamental difference here from the earlier example was that rather than choosing the group by manually configuring it, here we're querying the list to see what department the person belongs to, and then we're using a switch action to branch the workflow depending on whose department the user is joining. And as you can guess, if they're joining a sales department, they're going to be a member of a sales group in Active Directory that will give them the permissions they need. And of course, for each of the following groups as well. Again, a little bit more intelligence, a little bit less hard coding than we saw in the example previously. Again, we've got our error checking. And from there, it moves through pretty predictably. We're creating that user and exchange using the email address that we constructed earlier. We're enabling OCS for in-house instant messaging. We're creating a user profile using a web service call to SharePoint, and then we're updating that user profile in SharePoint with some more information that came through on the form. And finally, something that we didn't do at all in the last example is we're scheduling a recurring meeting between the manager and the new employee, and we're scheduling it to happen 3 months from the moment when they're hired. So essentially a probationary assessment, and with any luck, the person will keep their job, and it'll be a rolling meeting that will occur every quarter. Usually a pretty popular process that's part of HR that's quite important for a number of reasons to adhere to. That essentially is the onboarding scenario. Now, in this example, we didn't look at integration with other applications, but that's certainly something you can do. And it's something I mentioned in the earlier example just now. If you do have the product or you're evaluating it, you'll find a whole lot of options under integration that allow you to reach out and pull information, not just from forms like I showed you, but from any number of sources. Things like spreadsheets, in-house applications via web services, databases, CRM, BizTalk server. The list goes on, and you can push information to those areas as well. So it means that using SharePoint as a central repository for employee data and your single source of truth is a pretty compelling option. Okay, let's imagine that we need a document to be created on the back of this process. The user has joined, they've got everything they need, but we want them to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that whatever they learn and whatever they do with us, they're not going to take and sell to someone else. The way that we're going to do that is with 2 or 3 very powerful, very specific actions. SharePoint 2010 has brought significant changes, significant improvements to Word Services. Word Services 2010 allows us to read and update documents, Word documents in SharePoint, much like a form that we would create in InfoPath or maybe SharePoint Designer. And I'm not talking about just the metadata or the basic properties of the document, I'm talking about the actual content. So we leverage this really well with Nintex Workflow, and when we assemble documents, we're usually doing it in a 3-step process. It's a conversion, an update, and then another conversion. And the first conversion action is all about taking an existing template and converting it to a new blank document. And we're going to take that blank document and we're going to populate it with information that we have running through our workflow. So you saw me use a variable earlier to store a password. You can use those variables to store just about anything that you're grabbing as part of the process, whether it's information from a database or from a spreadsheet, as I said earlier, information from other applications, other areas of SharePoint, even other Word documents. All of that can be used in the update document action to populate that blank document. Once that's been populated, you don't necessarily have to convert it to another format, but quite often people like to do that because they want to take it from a Word 2010 file and maybe turn it into something that is easier to read, like a legacy document that they know is going to be more compatible with their audience, something very basic like an RTF or an earlier basic format, or even, and most popularly, a PDF. So you can get some interesting publication options going for yourself as well. Perhaps even once you've converted it, you might like to create a site in SharePoint automatically where it's hosted and send out emails to your audience members with links they can use to download the item. All of that, again, can be done drag and drop, no code. We can provision things like sites and site collections within SharePoint with Nintex workflow the same way that we're provisioning user accounts and Exchange accounts and Active Directory permissions. Okay, let's take a deeper look at a full-blown document assembly solution, something that's a little bit more complex than just these three actions. My example is contracts. I used a non-disclosure agreement in the earlier example. The one I'm using here is a little bit different, and the key to a good document assembly solution is the lists and document libraries that you're using to store and assemble that document. So I'm going to run you through those ingredients first before I actually show you the workflow. The first ingredient here is a request list. This is where people enter in the requests for contracts that they want created. And it's a pretty basic list: the name of the contract, the other party or parties that are involved besides our own, and the contract type. Those are the key details. The rest of it either gets populated by the workflow or is updated as the process goes forward. Another really important library is our templates library. This is where we store the document templates that our contracts are going to be based on. So for every option that users have when they choose the type of contract they want is a corresponding template that will get used by the workflow. And also in this list, we're storing contract specialists and contract reviewers. So these are people that are designated for each type of contract to be part of a revision and review process once the document has been created. So we've got our requests, we've got our templates, and we have two more libraries. One is a library where we store the draft documents, the documents that are under construction and the documents that are being reviewed. And finally, a completed library where we store the documents that are finished. So these ones are probably going to end up as PDF by the time they get to this library, and we might even make this library publicly accessible, or at least accessible to our audience, so that they can come and serve themselves. Okay, let's take a look at the workflow sitting behind the requests lists. Again, it's all built in. I don't need to open anything outside of SharePoint. And here's what our workflow looks like. The first thing that we're doing is querying that list and finding out what kind of contract type it is. And we're setting a variable so that we know which branch to execute. And you'll see that I've cheated a little bit in this example. There's really only one branch that makes anything happen, and that's the vendor service agreement. In a real scenario, I would probably have document assembly actions happening for every type of document. But in this scenario, if they choose any other option, they're just going to get notifications sent to somebody asking them to assemble the document themselves. If we did choose a vendor service agreement, then I'm updating the status in that list for that request item to show that we're now getting further details from the people involved. And here's a first example of gathering information that we're going to use to update that blank document. Now, as I mentioned when I was talking a little bit about integration, there's a good dozen or two ways that you can use to gather information. But one of the most interesting ones is gathering it directly from users. And what makes it interesting is that you can gather this information after the workflow has already started. So this isn't information that people are filling out in a form in order to get the process going. This is information that people are filling out because they've been asked for it halfway through the business process. And in this case, we're just asking for two pieces of information. We're asking for a scope of work and a rate schedule. And in choosing this type of form, this method of gathering information, an online form will be created automatically by Nintex Workflow so that when the users receive their notification, they'll be able to click on a URL. They'll have two fields that they can use to fill out the information and save it that way. So it's a pretty painless operation. Once the users have filled out that information, then we're going to progress down the chain. We're going to eventually convert that document from a template to a blank document, and we're going to update it using the information that we gathered from that request data action. So there's our scope of work, and there's our rate schedule. And we're pulling the other party field from the form itself. So the client name is one control point, and then scope, and then rate schedule as well. If you haven't worked with word services and control points and control content, you can picture it like this. The Word documents are essentially forms with fields in them that can be read in SharePoint and updated in SharePoint like we're doing here automatically. And there's a lot of great resources online that you can use to learn a bit more about it, both Microsoft resources and third-party resources. And you can create these kinds of Word forms or templates without any code. It's actually pretty painless to do. Now, for those of you who are still on SharePoint 2007, this kind of thing might be the bit of added value from a SharePoint 2010 migration that you could be looking for. This kind of document assembly and word services capability and process integration from Workflow 2010 as well are some very strong arguments for moving forward and getting the most out of that SharePoint platform. So bear that in mind if you've got those migration projects in the back of your mind. Once we've updated that document and populated it with the information that we gathered from the user, then we're starting our review process. I'm querying my list and getting the contract specialist and the reviewer that was listed in that templates library. You'll remember that in addition to the type of contract that's associated with the template that we're using, we're also storing the reviewers and the specialists that are associated with that template. So that's how we know who to involve in this next revision process and review process. Again, we're using a state machine, so we're not moving from an ABC kind of a perspective. It's not necessarily linear. What happens is that we're starting with the revisions team, and they can either cancel the work, in which case we end that state machine, or they can submit it for review. And if they decide to submit it for review, then it's with the review team. If the review team rejects it, instead of the workflow ending or the process of state machine finishing, we're changing state back to the revisions team. So it's a cyclical review process. Once it gets as far as the review team, it's never going to not go forward. The worst thing that can happen is that it goes back a step to the revisions team, or it gets approved and we finish by converting that document to PDF. Once that's done, we're sending out notifications letting people know where it's available and that it's been completed, and we're updating the status of that item to show that the contract has been fully provisioned. So that's what a fully blown document assembly solution looks like. That's pretty typical to what you might see in the real world, what we see our partners and customers creating out there. Again, you've got a lot of integration options that you can look at for pulling information into documents. We only used one, and we requested data from individual users. and populated it that way. But have a think about some of the options you might have available, particularly if you'd like to put together sales-related documents, perhaps project-related documents. These things go very nicely with CRM integration that allows you to pull client data and opportunity information into your documents, perhaps for tenders. Or you might want to create a project sign-off document or contract based on projects that are underway. You might be pulling that information from spreadsheets, from databases, or you might even be using the Nintex Workflow add-on, Workflow for Project Server, to pull that information directly out of Project Server and start building your project document assets that way. So a lot of very powerful features revolve and can be leveraged by document assembly. Okay, let's see what we've got in the way of questions. We're 3 or 4 minutes ahead of schedule, which is nice. So let's see what we've got. By the way, there are some great resources that you can look at for inspiration. You might check the Nintex website. You'll see case studies and showcase entries from our partners all around the world. And connect.nintex.com is also a great place to look. You'll find downloads there available, how-to articles, things like that. Okay, I've got a question here. Are the document assembly and Word services only available on the Enterprise Edition? That is exactly right. Also, you might need to go with the fully licensed SharePoint Server Edition if you want to make use of the Excel services queries as well. It doesn't relate directly to Nintex Workflow, of course, but Excel services is something that's packaged with that SharePoint Server Edition. Another one, does Update Document only work for Word or also for Excel? That's an excellent question. Update Document only works for Word, but we do have the ability to update Excel with the Excel services query. It actually gives you the ability to populate Excel spreadsheets as well as query them for information. So you can even start making calculations with them. Very popular feature for project managers who are still using spreadsheets, or sometimes finance people and salespeople who are doing currency conversions and things like that. Not a bad feature to use. Could we get an export of the workflows you showed? There are some interesting downloads that you can find at connect.nintex.com. It may not be exactly this workflow, but you'll find information there that will guide you in the right direction, certainly. Let me bring that up on the screen and give you an idea of what it looks like. So for those of you who don't know, connect.nintex.com is our online Nintex community, and it's plainly huge. We've got tens of thousands of registered users and threads going, amazing forums that are monitored and managed by our dev team and our support guys, and our download section gives you a wealth of information that you can use for precisely this kind of stuff. Installation guides, tutorials, how-to documents, downloads, all kinds of good stuff there to look for. We have here, does the schedule review action connect to the Outlook calendar or a SharePoint calendar? It can do both, depending on the action that you want to use. I didn't really configure it to any great extent in my example, but you have a couple of options. So if you wanted to create an appointment in Outlook, you could certainly do that. We have nice Outlook integration actions to use there. You can even invite people to meetings and schedule rooms and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff you can do along the lines of user interaction that we didn't really dig too deeply into. But working through Outlook and working through SharePoint to do actions and tasks is a pretty effective way of managing a business process and moving things along. Here's another good one. Is there any known performance problems with SharePoint or IIS when running a large number of workflows at the same time? I get asked that a lot. Basically what we're using here is the SharePoint workflow engine. So it scales along with SharePoint. That means that if you have multiple SharePoint servers in your farm, then you're going to have better workflow performance. And it's very hard to give you concrete numbers around the volume of workflows or the number of actions in the workflows, because it really depends what those workflows are doing. Some of them might be querying databases and performing other fairly intensive actions or time-consuming actions. Some of them might be doing very short, quick actions that consume almost no IT resources to speak of. But in general, if you have a SharePoint farm that is performant enough to handle the browsing on your portal of the users that are going to be involved in workflows. So for example, if you have 5,000 users and they're all using your SharePoint portal and you have reasonable performance and hardware demand as a result of that traffic, when I say reasonable, I mean sort of best practice Microsoft type reasonable, which is probably 50 to 60% sustained CPU usage, that kind of thing, then chances are you're going to be fine if all those people start running workflows. Ideally, what you want to do is approach it in a staging type environment. If you think that you're looking at 10, 20, 30,000 concurrent workflows, which is certainly something that we see out there, probably best to do it department by department. When in doubt, follow the Microsoft best practices for that kind of thing. Again, we're not using anything but the SharePoint workflow engine, so there's really only one set of best practices you need to be concerned about, and that's Microsoft's. I can tell you that in all the time that I've been working at Nintex and talking to customers and partners, which would be literally hundreds of people, the only time that I've heard anybody do any kind of hardware intervention to support workflow was when they had workflows running in the magnitude, again, tens of thousands of them, and they added, I think it was 16 gig of RAM to their server. That was as much as they had to do. Here's an interesting question. Just out of curiosity, how many people joined this webinar session? There's currently 81 people online at the moment, which is a pretty reasonable turnout. Another one here is, I have made changes to this workflow. How would it affect any workflow actions which are already initiated? The answer is it wouldn't. We're using the SharePoint workflow engine, so the way that that works is that any new workflows that are triggered after you make that change will go forward with the change. Workflows that are already running will continue on as they were originally created. So one of the things that I coach people with is if you have very long processes that are running over the space of weeks or even months, and you want that ability to change workflows without having to do too much backpedaling, too much intervention along the way, then what you might want to do is break that long workflow into a series of smaller workflows. And you can use actions within the designer to start the next workflow in the chain. What that does is it allows you to segregate the amount of rollback efforts you might need to take. So rather than having to do everything again or roll everything back manually, you'll only have to roll it back as far as your last workflow. Another question, can you still use the request form if the workflow is automatically started? Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. So once the workflow is running, it still frees up the form to be used by subsequent people. So if you get somebody creating a new item in that list, they'll get a new blank form of their own to use. And if you're talking about the form that was used to submit the request, then you can access the fields of that form with Nintex workflow, and you can even modify it and have other workflows be triggered as a result. So it really depends on how fancy you want to get. There's some nice InfoPath integration that you can do as well. Our SDK is free and details a whole bunch of stuff that you can do. Things like building buttons onto the form to approve and reject, or calling workflows directly from forms rather than having them live in lists and libraries. You can do quite a bit in that area. Another one, can you connect to the SAP Web Services out of the box? Yes, you can. The easiest way to do that is with a web service call. So I think I have an example of a web service call here. Where did I put it? That is in an earlier workflow. I'll just jump in and get that for you. Web service calls are really popular forms of integration because it allows you to plug into just about anything. And we went to a fair amount of effort to make it even easier than it normally would be. So web service calls are really the only place that you have the opportunity to do a bit of development and pump a bit of code directly into the workflow designer. And here's an example of a web service call that we used to create a SharePoint profile from scratch. Now, on the surface, this action looks pretty simple. It's really just asking us for a couple of fields, and we're storing the result in variables. So your action that you build for SAP could look very much like that. It could be a couple of fields of input and maybe a couple of fields of output. But what it's actually doing behind the scenes is something else entirely different. So we give you the ability to build these actions and hide the complexity from the designers themselves. So in this case, the action is actually a web service call, and rather than exposing this code and all of these configuration parameters and things to the everyday designers of the workflow, I'm packaging it up in what we call a user-defined action. So this could very well be a call to SAP. In this case, it's a call to SharePoint itself. But if you don't want to type in the code, then once you put in the URL and the credentials, you can use what we call a SOAP builder. And in that case, we give you a list of web methods or conversations you can have with that application at the other end, and fields that you can fill out the information that that web method is expecting. So you actually don't have to write any code in that case either. You just need to know what the URL is for the application you're talking to and some credentials that will give you what you need. That's one way that we see SAP integration happen, is through those web service calls. Of course, you can query databases as well, but not always the easiest or best thing to do, hit those back-end databases directly. We also have third-party, what we call technology partners out there that have some really nice SAP and SharePoint integration capability as well. And they're partners of ours. So what they do is certainly certified and compatible with Nintex workflow as well. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Just bear with me here. Sometimes a workflow creates two tasks and two corresponding emails for only one approval task. How can we avoid this? That's an interesting question. I think what you're asking is, can we have a single task, like an approval task, that sends different emails depending on the people that are assigned to that action? I actually have an example of exactly that sitting right here. Let me just bring it up here. I believe it's in this list here. The secret to this is, again, variables. So you're basically determining who is going to receive that email before the action runs, and the email content or the body of the message is a variable itself. I think this is the one that I did it. Yes, it is. So here's a typical notification email. This could be an approval action as well. It'll also have a notification section like this. But you'll notice that instead of an actual typed message, I'm using a variable. So I can insert variables wherever I want, and I can insert them back into actions like this one as well. So you can see I have two variables I can use. I can do, where is it? Oh, it's in the review notification message. There it is there. So I set that variable earlier in the workflow to determine what that message is actually going to be. Here it is here. That's where I set the variable. I look at the action. I look at a list to determine what kind of notification is going to be needed within that action. And then I use the set variable action to map all of that text, which is pasted in here, to the variable that I'm using for the message body. So in that way you can have one action, but different notification text bodies that actually get used depending on who that action is assigned to. I got time for one more, and it is, how can I migrate Nintex Workflow 2007 into 2010? It's actually a piece of cake. You can check connect.nintex.com. That's probably the best place to go for that. You'll find some nice articles on how to do that. Yeah, there it is right there. And it really is not a big deal. We did a whole lot of testing on this. We worked very closely with Microsoft. Our testers pretty much beat it to death before we released it. And I haven't heard of a single instance of anyone having trouble. Your workflows, even if they're currently running and you choose to do an in-place upgrade, those currently running workflows will be upgraded and migrated seamlessly as well. So really it's more about what kind of SharePoint migration you want to do. Plan that out first, whether it's an in-place upgrade or whether it's a side-by-side upgrade. Nintex Workflow can accommodate both, and you won't lose any of the work that you've done. All right, guys, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for joining. Thanks for hanging out. As I said, if you'd like to give us any feedback about what you might like to see again or what you might like maybe a deeper look at, then feel free to fill that out when you log off. If there are questions that I didn't get to that you'd like answered, fill those in as well, and someone will certainly get back to you with whatever you need. If you haven't played with this product yet, I would suggest a free download on our website. Another alternative is a hosted site that you can sign up for. If you don't feel like installing it in your own environment, we'll provision an online site you can use to play around to your heart's content. Finally, next month's webinar is Human Resources Automation, Powerful Tools for Critical Processes, and I'll be hosting that one as well. It'll be a bit less of a technical, product-focused webinar, a little bit more about business and the pains that are felt in the HR department and how automation might help with those pains. So for a little bit more information on that, tune in to nintex.com/events, and of course for more workflow information, nintex.com/workflow. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you again soon.